Good day. One of the difficulties of trying to keep up with events around the world over the course of this crisis is that the events take place incredibly quickly. No sooner had I finished my program yesterday, which centered on the situation in Ukraine and Taiwan, then we got news that there's been a flare-up of tension in Kosovo between the authorities of Kosovo, this former province of or autonomous region of Serbia, which broke away with Western help in the early 2000s, and which is recognized by some Western countries and some other countries as an independent state, but which is not so recognized by others. Well, news came through that the authorities of this, I will call it country, were in conflict with the Serb population in northeast Kosovo, which has been unhappy, to put it mildly, at the events which caused Kosovo's forcible removal from Serbia as a result of the NATO war against Serbia of 1999. Now, I've given a very summary account of what happened in 1999 and since, and of Kosovo's status. This is a huge topic. I've discussed it many times. I've made known my own strong disagreement, both with the 1999 NATO war and with the whole process of Kosovo secession, and the legalities of the whole process and the way in which it was done. But I don't intend to get sidetracked in this program by going over all those discussions all over again. Anyway, suffice to say that the authorities in Kosovo have attempted to impose various registration or re-registration documents on the people, the Serb people in northeastern Kosovo, who basically do not recognize the legitimacy of the Kosovo authorities in the Kosovo capital of Pristina. The Kosovo authorities retaliated by deploying or seeking to deploy the police. The Serbian government in turn responded by deploying military units to the border with Kosovo, and for a while it looked as if a military clash was about to happen. Certainly the situation continues to be extremely tense. Now, I'm going to say a few things here about this particular incident. The first is that I personally do not believe that any decision of this nature would be made in Pristina, in the capital of Kosovo, without a green light from their friends, if I can call them that, their supporters in Washington and Brussels and London. So I think that the Kosovo authorities clearly did not act by themselves in making this measure. I say that I don't want to deny them agency. I'm sure that they have very strong feelings about the Serbs in Kosovo who dispute their legitimacy, but nonetheless, on an issue which affects security, the security of Kosovo, which is in effect guaranteed by the Western powers, I cannot believe that the authorities in Pristina would have acted by themselves. And I have to also say that I do not think that it is a coincidence that this incident has happened at this particular time when we have the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Now, I say that even though this particular affair of the re-registration of Serbs, it has been discussed and mooted for quite a while. It's been an ongoing process. There's been discussions about the mechanics of it for several weeks. But I have to say that it seems to me that even allowing for that, the timing seems to have been brought forward from the autumn, and I can't help but think that the purpose here is to distract Russian attention. Russia is deeply committed to Serbia. Serbia is one of Russia's most important friends and allies in Europe. The president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, essentially came to power as a result of a crisis in 1999 over Serbia, directly following upon the attack upon Serbia. Yugoslavia still was at that time, by the Western powers. And this is a matter, an issue about which the Russians care. And of course, if you want to distract them, if you want to draw their attention away from events in Ukraine, well, I can imagine that some people in Washington and London and Brussels, and perhaps in Paris and Berlin, thought to themselves that stirring up trouble between in Kosovo between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians might be a good way to do it. And I'm also going to say something else. I think that this story has to be understood in the overall context of the situation in the Balkans. Now, again, this is a complex topic. I'm not going to go into the full details in this program, but all I will say is this is a region I know. I am, after all, Greek. I have roots not just in Greece, but in northern Greece, in the area of Epirus. It's a part of the world that I'm familiar with. I know its history very well, so I speak here with some authority. And I'm going to say straight away that it seems to me that what that pattern of Western and NATO interventions in the 1990s and early 2000s has been to create a situation where Serbia, still in Balkan terms a powerful country, is now surrounded by a chain of unstable microstates. You could almost call them NATO protectorates: Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Bosnia, against which Serbia has historic claims. It's got historic claims against all of them. And anybody who is familiar with the history of the Balkans, not just the recent history, but the long-term history of the Balkans, knows that this is an unsustainable situation, that sooner or later this is all going to blow, and that we are going to have a crisis in the Western Balkans, which will make the crisis of the 1990s look like a roadside picnic. Having said all of that, I'm going to say further that I think this particular crisis that we're witnessing at this moment in time in Kosovo is going to be contained. And the reason for this is that I think that there are enough people in all the various key capitals, in Belgrade certainly, but also in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, London and Paris, who understand very well how extremely dangerous the situation potentially is, how that explosion that I've just talked about is a real possibility, and how, if an explosion of that kind were to take place, it would be extremely difficult to manage for the Western powers at this particular time, especially with public sentiment in some NATO countries, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and several others, probably running extremely strongly in Serbia's favour. So for all of these reasons, I think that this particular crisis will be contained. And in fact, the latest reports are that the Kosovo authorities have now postponed the re-registration process that they were trying to impose on the Serbs. What this incident shows is how incredibly dangerous the situation internationally has become. I repeat my view that this is a powder keg that we have in the Western Balkans, but for the moment it is a stable powder keg, if I can say it in that way. It's one that nobody is particularly looking to let off, to cause it to explode. Except it seems that there are some people who want to take dangerous risks, and we see that they are both ready and willing to do so, and that unfortunately they have collaborators who are keen to go along with what they want in Pristina. So I think we will overcome this particular incident. I think this incident will be resolved, or at least the problems concerning it will be postponed, but it is an indication of how incredibly dangerous the whole situation, the global situation with this crisis has become. Just as there are people who were ready to see the situation in Ukraine explode and have now achieved that, just as there are other people who seem to be willing to take extraordinary risks over Taiwan and over the position in the Pacific. More about that in a moment. So it seems that there are people who are prepared to take terrible risks with the Western Balkans, and of course, if we look farther afield, with Iran and the Gulf as well. So we are in an extremely precarious time, and frankly, it needs strong nerves and cool judgment, and I have to say, for the moment, we're not getting much sign of that in the White House, where many of the key decisions must be made. Now, I mentioned China and the Pacific situation. The latest reports, as I'm making this program, is that Nancy Pelosi is intending to visit Taiwan tomorrow. That's to say Tuesday, 2nd August. I'm going to postpone discussion of this until I actually know that she's there, and until we have some better understanding of what the Chinese response is going to be. I will merely repeat what I have said already, that trust between the Chinese and US governments has now almost completely broken down. We've now had Chinese reports which have confirmed the tense character of the conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden that I discussed recently in that program I did. In fact, the Chinese unofficially are saying that Xi Jinping spoke with a harshness and a toughness towards Biden that he has never shown to any other leader that he has ever spoken to up to now. And that, of course, confirms my take of the Chinese readout, which I gave in my program a little while ago, that this is an extraordinarily tense call reflecting a very tense situation. And given how tense the situation has become and how strong the Chinese warnings have become, I'm afraid that there is a very real risk that things could indeed get out of control, though I still think, on balance, that the Chinese will exercise a certain measure of restraint and will prepare their positions very carefully. However, just to finish on this, I also believe that the Chinese are now convinced that the United States, or at least this administration, is now aiming to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, just as the Russian government earlier this year came to the conclusion that despite its protestations to the contrary, the US objective remained to bring Ukraine into NATO. And just as the Russian view of American intentions is what has directly led us to this conflict in Ukraine, so I am sorry to say that the Chinese view of American intentions with respect to Taiwan now makes it a virtual certainty that some kind of Chinese move against Taiwan is now only a matter of time. So that's where we are, and we see again how dangerous the international situation has become. But I'm going to turn in this program to again back to the situation in Ukraine. I'm going to give a very summary account now about the military situation. The first thing to say is that the Ukrainian military has now acknowledged that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Bakhmut city, that fighting is taking place in Bakhmut city, this important city which is the linchpin of the current Ukrainian defense line in Donbass, and whose fall would lead to the collapse of that defense line. And the same Ukrainian officials, military officials, have also, for the first time, acknowledged Russian advances in the fortified area opposite Donetsk city, that the Russians have punched through holes through the Ukrainian defenses, that they are now advancing on villages like Pesky and Avdiivka, which are major linchpins of this defense line. So it does increasingly appear that the situation in Donbass is getting very tough for Ukraine. And at the same time, I have to say this, it's another day which has passed, and we hear a lot more about a possible Ukrainian offensive in Kherson, but it still hasn't happened. Well, perhaps it will eventually, but so far, I have to say this may change, but for the moment, Ukrainian moves in this area have been somewhat unimpressive. The Russians, by the way, have also claimed today that they have destroyed 2 more Highmar launch vehicles. Now, that would bring the total of Highmar launch vehicles that the Russians claim to have destroyed to 6. It's not entirely clear how many Highmar systems there are in Ukraine at this present time, but the total number that may have been delivered up to now may have been 12, in which case half the Highmar launchers would have been destroyed, if you believe what the Russians are saying. Many people, of course, don't. And, of course, there's 4 more that are supposed to be on their way from the United States. And Germany has now, for its part, supplied 3 tracked M270 multiple launch rocket systems, which are similar in some respects to the Highmars. So that's the state of events on the battlefields, or so it seems to me. There's been lots of reports, by the way, of heavy Ukrainian losses, more film of Ukrainian units refusing to fight. I've seen a video of what purports to be a Ukrainian unit, its soldiers complaining about the poor leadership they're getting from the military command. Now, obviously, I'm not in a position to corroborate these videos, though most of them, the authenticity of most of them, doesn't seem to be disputed. But I presume that they are authentic, and it does look as if Ukrainian forces in Donbass, what's left of Donbass, that's still under Ukrainian control, are becoming increasingly demoralized. And that may provide a possible explanation of some of these really rather disturbing moves that we've been seeing, like that missile attack or series of explosions in the prisoner of war camp, on the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, which caused the death of 53 Azov soldiers, and this extraordinary artillery barrage on Donetsk city, which seems to have been intended to seed the city with anti-personnel mines of a sort that might do serious injury to any civilians that stepped on them. And it's difficult to find any military logic to these moves, whichever side was responsible for them. I have to say that I find the Ukrainian protestations that it was the Russians who launched an attack or engineered an explosion in their own prisoner of war camp, and that it was the Russians who shelled their own city and planted anti-personnel mines there. I find all that extremely difficult to understand. If it is the Ukrainians, then it suggests a Ukrainian military that is getting very angry and very frightened and very desperate, and which as a result is resorting to actions which, to be straightforward about it, could be investigated as potential war crimes. So that seems to me to be the military situation. The latest twist, however, in the Ukrainian conflict, in some ways, is, and the most interesting one that is happening, is not happening on the battlefields. It is happening in the economic war. And it's now, I think, becoming clear that the sanctions are starting to erode. The Western sanctions against Russia are starting to erode. Now, about 2-3 weeks ago, there was that agreement about shipping Ukrainian grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. That was initialed in Istanbul. I said in the video that was done at the time, that I did at the time, that this agreement appeared to promise a great deal less than it really meant, because the Russians have always insisted that they have never at any point in time sought to prevent Ukrainian cargo ships carrying grain or fertilizer from leaving Black Sea ports, that the Russians instead wanted to see a certain amount of demining of those ports, the mines having been laid by the Ukrainians, and that is something that the Ukrainians appear to have done, and certainly that they seem to commit themselves to doing during those talks in Istanbul. And also, I said that the Russians had said that any moves to free up exports by sea of Ukrainian grain needed to be made in conjunction with moves by the Western powers, specifically by the European Union, to make clear that Russian food and fertilizer exports, which are far more important than Ukrainian exports, that those restrictions, any restrictions on those Russian food and fertilizer exports, simply did not exist or would not be enforced. And the European Union indeed published a statement the day before the Istanbul agreements, or agreements, there were several of them, were initialed, confirming that the EU is not sanctioning Russian food exports or Russian fertilizer exports. And it was the Russians, as I said, who actually unblocked the exports of their food and fertilizer products, which are on a much bigger scale than those of Ukraine. So that was a first step by the Western powers to ease off on the economic war against Russia. But now we've had another step. It's received minimal publicity in the Western media, but it is arguably even more important. And I'm going to take this now all from an article in the Financial Times, and it relates to trade in Russian oil. Now, what you need to understand is that back in March, the United States and Britain imposed import bans on Russian oil, which is being exported to the United States and to Britain. As it turns out, it's still possible for Russian oil to reach the United States and Britain through middlemen, but the Russians are not able to export their oil directly to the United States and Britain. And after a vast amount of arms twisting and argument, as part of their 6th sanctions package, the EU leaders eventually agreed that they would do the same thing. And they announced last month that Russian exports of ship-borne oil to the EU would cease by the end of this year. And even more importantly, the EU also said that as of the end of this year, the EU would refuse to provide insurers in the EU would be prohibited from providing insurance for Russian tankers, or indeed for any tankers transporting Russian oil anywhere in the world. Now, the EU insurance industry actually accounts for only a relatively small part of the world of the insurance, the shipping insurance market, the global shipping insurance market. The dominant player here historically has been London, and of course Britain is no longer in the EU. But at the time when the EU announced that package of sanctions affecting trade in Russian oil, the British indicated that they would coordinate with the EU, and that as of the end of this year, the British would indeed stop providing insurance cover for tankers transporting Russian oil anywhere in the world. Now, I've said many times that in my opinion this is not going to be anywhere near as effective a sanction as some people think. The Russians are in a position to provide insurance cover for their own tankers, and perhaps even for the tankers of other countries, and they will no doubt do so. So this would not stop trade in Russian oil completely in the way that the Western powers apparently think it will. But nonetheless, there's no doubt that it would disrupt it. And it's clear that the West is now having cold feet about this, because from their point of view, they are worried that if these sanctions have any effectiveness at all, and that trading in Russian oil declines from December, then that will mean, in effect, that oil prices will rise, causing inflation in the West to increase further at precisely the time when the Western governments are desperate to try to bring inflation under control. And of course in Europe the problem is even greater, because Europe is already facing an energy crisis because of reductions in supply of Russian natural gas, and of course any further increase in oil prices in that kind of context would be catastrophic, and to say it mildly, deeply unwelcome. Well, yesterday in the Financial Times, we got confirmation that the Western governments are now bowing to the inevitable, and that they're starting to roll back these sanctions. Now, this article in the Financial Times is behind a paywall. It's relatively short, however, and I will read it. I will now read it out. And the title is West eases effort to restrict Russian oil trading as inflation and energy risks mount. Plan to shut Moscow out of maritime insurance market delayed. European governments have eased back on efforts to curb trade in Russian oil, delaying a plan to shut Moscow out of the vital Lloyd's of London maritime insurance market, and allowing some international shipments amid fears of rising crude prices and tighter global energy supplies. The EU announced a worldwide ban on the provision of maritime insurance to vessels carrying Russian oil 2 months ago, expecting coordinated action with the British government. However, the United Kingdom is yet to introduce similar restrictions. UK participation is pivotal to the effectiveness of any such ban, because London is at the centre of the marine insurance industry. Meanwhile, Brussels in late July amended some curbs on dealing with state-owned Russian companies, citing concerns over global energy security. This was in that same statement in which the EU announced that there were no sanctions on Russian food and fertilizer exports. When I passed that statement, in an earlier video, I expressed some surprise and puzzlement as to what the reference to energy and to dealing with Russian state companies, state-owned companies, was all about. Well, now we know that the EU is in effect allowing third parties to trade with these companies, to trade in the export of Russian oil products. And to continue with the Financial Times article, a joint UK-EU prohibition on maritime insurance would constitute the most comprehensive restriction to date on Russian oil, ending access to much of the global tanker fleet for Moscow's exports. But US officials have expressed concern that an immediate global ban on maritime insurance would push up prices by pulling millions of barrels of Russian crude and petroleum products off the market. European and British officials told the Financial Times in May that the UK had agreed with the EU to coordinate a ban on insuring Russian oil cargoes. However, Britain's latest sanctions against Russia, approved by Parliament in July, only prohibit providing insurance to vessels carrying Russian oil to the UK, and only after December 31st. So, the worldwide ban is not in effect, not even as of the end of this year. So far, the worldwide ban on insurance from London for tankers carrying Russian oil only applies to tankers supplying oil to Britain, which of course has already said that it's not going to import Russian oil. And note that this only applies, this limit on insurance for tankers shipping Russian oil to Britain only begins on December 31st. To continue, the legislation was introduced after the government promised to outlaw the import of Russian oil from the end of the year, but does not ban the provision of services to shipments from Russia to other countries, British officials said. So someone in the British government has been talking to the Financial Times and has told them that there is no restriction for the moment by Britain on insurance cover for tankers transporting Russian oil to any country except Britain. And then we go on to read the following. There is no current UK ban affecting global shipments of Russian oil, said Patrick Davison, underwriting director of the Lloyd's Market Association, an industry group for insurers at Lloyd's. Given the global nature of the reinsurance industry, the existence of the EU restrictions may well impact appetite for Russian oil shipments in London. He said Lloyd's was in close contact with the British government and will work with them on any future sanctions they seek to introduce. The UK Treasury, obviously they're in touch with the Financial Times, said it was still exploring the best course of action. We stand ready to impose further sanctions on Russia and are working in conjunction with our allies at pace to ensure these can be implemented with maximum effect on the Russian economy, it said. The EU's insurance ban was introduced on June 4th and remains in place. It prevents companies in the bloc from writing new insurance for any vessel carrying Russian oil anywhere. Existing contracts remain valid until December 5th, when all such business will be banned. However, the EU has amended part of its own sanctions to permit European companies to deal with some Russian state-owned entities, such as Rosneft, that's the biggest Russian oil company, for the purpose of transporting oil to countries outside the bloc. So, a tanker with oil from Rosneft can apparently obtain insurance from an EU insurer, provided it's not supplying the oil to the EU itself. And it goes on to say, the Financial Times article goes on to say, European companies will no longer be blocked from paying the likes of Rosneft if those transactions are strictly necessary for the purchase or transport of crude or petroleum products to third countries, a European Commission spokesman told the Financial Times. That's a very garbled paragraph, but from what I can see, it means that European companies which want to transport Russian oil sold by Rosneft, by the way, by a big measure, Russia's biggest oil exporter, oil supplied by Rosneft, provided it's not going to the EU, any tanker transporting it can get insurance cover from an EU insurer, provided the transaction is strictly necessary. But what does strictly necessary mean? I mean, it could mean much or it could mean little. I suspect that before long, pretty much every transaction with oil from Rosneft will be rubber stamped as strictly necessary. At least that's my guess. And then the article goes on to say the EU said in a statement that the measures were taken to avoid any potential negative consequences for food and energy security around the world. So we don't want to see oil prices rise. We don't want to see food prices rise. So we impose sanctions on Russian oil, but because food and oil are short, we're not going to enforce them. We're not going to enforce them so as to prevent Russian food and Russian oil being traded. And to continue, the White House has been working since June to push G7 countries to support a price cap mechanism that would allow some Russian oil to reach third countries as long as they agree to pay a below market price for the cargo. A below market price. But bear in mind that Russian oil exported to China and India is already being sold at less than the official price on the various exchanges. It's already being sold at a discount. So it looks like this is going to be a very flexible price cap. And then to continue, officials in Washington said the US and UK still plan to ban maritime services, including insurance, by the time the EU's ban takes full effect in December. But they want an oil price cap first. US President Biden is keen to reduce gasoline prices before midterm elections in November. So, they need this price cap in order that they can justify continuing to provide insurance for the trade in Russian oil, because they need Russian oil to continue to be traded, because if it isn't, there will be an explosion in oil prices, or that's what they fear, and the prospect for the Democrats will be sunk in the midterm elections in November. And of course, there would be a major economic crisis in the West and especially in Europe if oil prices exploded, as they might very easily do. Now, that makes this oil price cap idea look increasingly like the Istanbul Agreement about exporting grain from Ukraine. It's essentially a device, a face-saving device, to row back on the plan to withdraw insurance for trade in Russian oil. Now, in fairness to Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, who's come up with this oil price cap idea, she was always opposed to this policy by the EU of banning the import of Russian oil. She was always worried about what effect it might have on the international oil market and on the situation with prices, oil prices, and on inflation. And she tried to dissuade the Europeans from going down that particular route, and she floated the price cap idea way back in March, as I remember. But the Germans, Robert Habeck, and the Vice Chancellor and Economics Minister, and of course Ursula von der Leyen of the Commission, wouldn't listen. Now Yellen is coming back and saying this has turned out horribly wrong. We face a worldwide shortage of oil. Oil prices might explode at the end of this year. So let's row back on the insurance issue and let's get the insurance. Let's green light insurance for trade in Russian oil. Let's lift those restrictions on the trade in Russian oil. We need Russian oil circulating in the markets. So let's revive this price cap idea. Except, of course, that the price cap idea is unenforceable. And I am coming round to the view that Janet Yellen knows that it is, and that her real purpose is not so much, as she claims, to make it more difficult for the Russians to sell oil. It is to somehow extinguish these misconceived EU sanctions. Now, I'm going to come to what that means in a moment, but let me just finish with what the article, the Financial Times article, says. Sanctions lawyers said the EU appeared to be soft peddling its efforts to stem the global flow of Russian oil. There you go. That's the Financial Times saying it. And there was new uncertainty amongst traders over the UK's commitment to a global insurance ban. Sarah Hunt, a partner at HFW, a law firm, said trading houses were inquiring whether it is now legal to buy Rosneft oil to ship to countries outside the EU. Well, the answer is probably it is, but there's always, loopholes and uncertainties. And then she goes on to say, the new EU sanctions effectively permit the lifting of Russian crude by European companies. We were surprised by this. Lee Hansen, partner at Reed Smith, another law firm, said the EU's sanctions amendment was a big retreat, adding that lawyers had also been expecting more robust measures by now from the United Kingdom. So, the Americans have forced the British and the Europeans to retreat on the sanctions on Russian oil that Habeck and Ursula and all those others were pushing for ever since March, and which crystallized in July. The Americans have never been keen on this idea at all. They understand perhaps better how the global oil market works, and they've managed to get the Europeans and the British to reverse themselves. The reason is that doing otherwise would cause huge damage to the Democrats in the run-up to the midterms and might sink the global economy thereafter. So, food, fertilizer trade, Russian trade in food and fertilizer is now unrestricted. Oil trade, the Russian oil trade, well, it remains restricted because, of course, the Russians still can't sell directly to the EU or Britain or the United States, but they can sell their oil to everyone else, and it's looking increasingly likely that they will continue to be able to do so after the end of this year. In other words, those EU sanctions in that respect have become a dead letter. Now, the Russians will get less for their oil than they otherwise would, because obviously they're not able to sell oil directly to the EU and to the US and to Britain anymore. And when they sell their oil, they must sell it now at a discount to whoever is going to buy it. Also, from a Russian point of view, there is always this uncertainty about what the EU might do. I mean, one can imagine a sort of guerrilla war between the Commission and the tanker industry. Tankers, ship owners coming along saying, you know, we want to sell Rosneft oil because it's strictly necessary. The EU Commission saying, well, you know, we don't really think it is, and all that kind of thing. There's going to be all kinds of problems. So it's going to create some problems for the Russians, no question. But the British, the Americans, and above all the Europeans are now stuck because they can no longer buy Russian oil. And that is inevitably going to create imbalances and structural problems in the global oil market. It means that oil will be cheaper in some places where they can buy Russian oil at a discount, China, India, probably other countries in East Asia, Latin America, Africa, wherever. And it will be more expensive in Europe and in the United States. Moreover, if there are supply interruptions in those parts of the world from whence the Europeans, the Americans, the British now directly import their oil, let's say there's a crisis in the Gulf or a strike by oil workers in Nigeria, then that is going to have an even bigger impact than on the oil price in the West than it would previously have done, because you cannot replace that Gulf oil or that Nigerian oil, which is no longer flowing to you, by buying oil from the Russians. So we now have structural problems and imbalances on the global energy market. And besides, this whole system, this whole complicated mechanism that's been created, oil price caps, strange policies over insurance, all of this is a smuggler's or middleman's charter. Some people are going to make an absolute killing out of all of this, moving oil around from places where it's more expensive, where it's cheaper, from where it's cheaper to where it's more expensive, playing all kinds of games with the documents, getting premiums here, getting deals done there. This is going to mean that the oil market, always difficult to control, is now going to become almost uncontrollable. But that's where we are. We can't openly and straightforwardly lift the sanctions, because if we did so in the West, we would be admitting a massive policy error and we would be experiencing a terrible loss of face. So we come up with these strange devices, the Istanbul Agreement to allow Russian food and fertilizer to trade freely, this working around of the insurance ban through this complex device of the oil price cap to get us out of the mess that we have made for ourselves. And it doesn't stop there, because just before when I started making this program, I saw that there's now been a further relaxation of British sanctions. It seems that the British are now going to start providing insurance again to Russian aircraft engines on Russian planes and to other aviation products. And again, if you go back to that statement published by the EU, which I discussed a little while ago at the time of the Istanbul Agreement, it also referred to a relaxation of sanctions on aviation. And I didn't know what that meant. Well, it seems that part of what it meant is that you can now apparently fly from Cyprus to Moscow via Yerevan, and the EU has rubber stamped it. But it also probably means, it increasingly looks as if it means, that the EU is now relaxing its restrictions on the supply of spare parts for the Russian aircraft fleet. And that's why the British are now providing some degree of insurance cover. So the sanctions are being watered down, even as we speak. Well, it's not the end of the sanctions war. of the economic war. That continues, but we see how it's now crumbling at the edges and crumbling in important ways. But the damage has been done. The economic relationship between Russia and Europe has been destroyed. Trust has been destroyed. It will never be rebuilt. It will never return to that which it was. And at the same time, the Russians undoubtedly will continue with their eastward pivot to customers and business partners that they can have confidence in, that they can be sure that they have a stable long-term relationship with, which they can no longer trust or believe in where the Europeans are concerned. And in the meantime, and as a result of that, the reality is that people in Europe especially are going to be paying more for their energy, for their oil, their gas and their food than they would otherwise do. And because of all the problems and complexities that this is throwing up in the oil market, which I discussed earlier in this program, well, what that means is that this is now a permanent reality. We're going to have more expensive oil. This is even in disregard of, all the green policies and the taxes and all of that sort of thing on energy use that you have in Europe. Even putting that aside, oil prices in Europe are going to be structurally higher than they are in other places. And that, by the way, is a pattern that's going to repeat itself all around the world. A friend of mine who's just been to Pakistan, he's Pakistani, said to me that already in Pakistan people are noticing that the price of petrol is much lower in India than it is in Pakistan because of India's ability to import Russian oil. So this is now going to reproduce itself globally, and it's going to especially affect the West. Well, that's where we are when we launch upon these policies without thinking them through. Now, I'm going to finish with one very last word, which is about the resumption of shipborne Ukrainian grain exports. As I said in my program yesterday, a UN agency, the UN agency that's responsible for food security, has now come forward and has said that Ukraine is facing food shortages, that a third of Ukrainians are not able to get enough food. We're not talking about a famine. We are talking, however, about people not having as much to eat as would be necessary in order to keep them fully healthy. And yet, despite that, Ukraine is supposed to export its grain. One wonders how Ukrainian people feel about this, how they feel as they see ships leaving Odessa with Ukrainian grain. Do they feel happy about the fact that their country is exporting grain? Or do they feel that perhaps with food prices rising in Ukraine itself, with people having less food in Ukraine than they want to or perhaps need, that perhaps it would be better if all that grain that is being exported were to stay at home? Well, that's all I'm going to say about that topic today. That's all, in fact, I'm going to say about the topics I've discussed in this video. I look forward to you joining me again soon. In the meantime, remember, you can find me and all our Duran videos, those made by the Duran, those made by Alex Christoforo, and of course my videos on our other platforms, first and foremost Locals, but also Rumble and Telegram and ODYSEE. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You will find links under this video. You can also support us by going to our shop and buying the great things you will find there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our polo shirts, our hoodies, our hats and all those things. And last but not least, Remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.